Welcome back to the Select Committee on Victoria Planning Provision Amendments VC257, 267 and 274. We now have a panel of local councils who will be providing evidence to the committee. Before we introduce folks, can I just advise our witnesses that all evidence taken is protected by parliamentary privilege as provided by the Constitution Act 1975 and the provisions of the Legislative Council standing orders. Therefore, the information you provide during the hearing is protected by law. You are protected against any action for what you say during this hearing, but if you go elsewhere and repeat the same things, those comments may not be protected by this privilege. Any deliberately false evidence or misleading of the committee may be considered a contempt of Parliament. All evidence is being recorded and you will be provided with a proof version of the transcript following the hearings. Transcripts will ultimately be made public and posted on the committee's website. Could I welcome you all? Thank you for your submissions. That's much appreciated. And also, I'm sure we required you to change a few calendars to get here on very short notice. So all of that is greatly appreciated. So thanks. So for the Hansard, can you please state your name and the organisation that you're representing, and maybe we'll start at this end of the table.
Thank you. Jeff Green from Whitehorse City Council.
Sophie Tawney from Boroondara City Council.
Scott Walker from Boroondara Council.
Hannah McBride-Burgess from Stonnington City Council.
Annalise Batista from Stonnington City Council.
And Matthew Cripps from Bayside City Council.
Thank you, and again, welcome. We'll just introduce the members of the committee. I'm David Ettershank, I'm the chair of the committee. Ms. Crozier. Oh.
Thank you, sorry.
David Davis.
Bev McCarthy. Sarah Mansfield.
Ryan Batchelor.
Sheila Watt.
Tom McIntosh.
All right, let's get into it. So maybe about 5 to 10 minutes per council. Who'd like to kick off? Jeff, please.
Thank you. So thank you, Chair and committee members. So we welcome the opportunity to present to this committee. We know that Victoria is facing a housing challenge and we're not here to dispute that. And we are supportive of increasing housing supply. But meaningful, lasting solutions can only come from a genuine partnership, where councils, communities and the state work together to plan for housing supply and livable communities. Council submits that good planning takes time and involves genuine engagement with communities and stakeholders. Recent planning reform in Victoria has been undertaken at a pace and breadth which has replaced best practice for speed and efficiency. Unfortunately, what we've seen through recent reform is a pattern of exclusion, where local knowledge has been sidelined and opportunities for input have been reduced. So take, for example, the recent Standing Advisory Committee report into the activity centres, and Ringwood in particular, which was closest to Whitehorse. And we had a report from the panel members appointed by the Minister that was very critical of the process and the terms of reference, for example, being given 10 business days in which to write their report. And there was over 1,000 submissions received from the public, but only 5 of those submissions were referred to the committee. Analysis of recent planning scheme amendments in Victoria shows that of the 108 approved amendments this year, since the start of this year, 70% of those were undertaken by the fast-track 20 Part 4 process. Of the 13 VC amendments approved in the same time frame, all were undertaken via the fast-track 20 Part 4 process. This is a significant use of the Minister's discretion. We are also seeing a gradual erosion of public and council rights in the planning system. Reforms like VC267 introduce tick-the-box pathways that remove local policy, neighbourhood character guidelines, and most significantly, appeal rights. These are not just technical changes, they fundamentally alter the way decisions are made and who is a part of them. Planning for housing delivery appears to be becoming an administrative task, not an integrated process that considers infrastructure provision, livability and sustainability. The impacts on Whitehorse will be significant. We have already done the strategic work. We've done a housing study, neighbourhood character study and various structure plans which allow for significant well-planned growth in the right locations. In 2014, Whitehorse implemented residential zones guided by a housing study and neighbourhood character study with strong support from the Department of Transport and Planning and ultimately the Minister. The zones were tailored with varied schedules that represented 11 neighbourhood typologies across the whole municipality. This work followed 2 years of consultation with our community. The housing capacity assessment that was undertaken as part of that project showed that we could deliver new housing and preserve neighbourhood character. It showed a capacity for approximately 82,000 dwellings through to 2031. It's noted that the state government housing target for Whitehorse is less than this, with a figure of 76,500 through to 2051. Further, in 2019, we reinforced this balance through a municipal-wide significant landscape overlay to protect our tree canopy. A capacity assessment undertaken as part of that work demonstrated a capacity for approximately 77,000 dwellings through to 2031. However, despite this strong strategic justification, extensive community consultation and support of the planning panel, the significant landscape overlay has only been approved on an interim basis with a series of 12 and 6-month extensions on about 7 occasions now. So unfortunately, the future of these controls is uncertain at the moment. We have demonstrated both in planning policy and on-the-ground development that Whitehorse can balance character, tree canopy and housing. We strongly oppose the state government decision to remove the varied schedules that I referred to before, which was done without community input or council support. This has significantly undermined the work council has done and will erode the character of our neighbourhoods. All this work has been made redundant and without any community consultation. Unfortunately, there appears to be a disproportionate focus on speed and supply at the cost of a coordinated and integrated planning process. Our approvals show that we support well-planned growth. 92% of applications submitted to council are approved. Over 7,500 dwellings have been approved in the last 5 years. However, only a third of these have not commenced construction. We don't see ourselves at all as a bottleneck or an obstacle. The market has its own dynamics: labour shortages, construction costs, shifts in demand, and then there is the tax system. These challenges cannot be solved by planning reform alone. A good example in relation to market dynamics is the example of the Box Hill Metropolitan Activity Centre. We endorsed and implemented a structure plan back in 2007 that allowed substantial growth. I'm sure you've seen the skyline at Box Hill now. We've approved 30 to 50-storey buildings with apartments. However, that work that we did there's about a 10-year lag between us allowing for that growth to occur and the growth actually starting. So it really depended on the market conditions, international investment, construction costs and demand. So it can take time for councils to set up the capacity and for that to be realised. Since 2020, for example, council has approved 1,500 dwellings in central Box Hill with a total development cost of $1.2 billion. Council was also working closely with the Suburban Rail Loop Authority to encourage further growth in Box Hill and Burwood. In fact, a significant redevelopment of Box Hill Central is yet to commence despite permits being issued about 3 years ago. So in short, council has undertaken extensive work to increase housing capacity. However, as you would realise, councils don't deliver the housing. There is much more to housing supply than just the planning system, and we therefore question the need for such expansive reform. While the goal of boosting housing supply is supported, as I've stated, we're concerned that there will be significant unintended consequences from this reform. For example, will we see more larger single dwellings? With over 580 knockdown rebuilds in Whitehorse per year, reduced standards will drive bigger homes, not necessarily more homes. Tree canopy loss is a major issue for council. As you would know, Plan for Victoria has an objective of 30% tree canopy, yet the new controls require as little as 10% tree canopy. Weaker sustainability outcomes. With local ESD policy sidelined, we end up with new homes that are less energy efficient and costlier to run. And also widespread confusion. The lack of testing of the controls prior to their release has resulted in poor drafting and difficulty in interpretation. And already council is dealing with challenges and debates with applicants about whether something is or isn't deemed to comply. So I think we ending up with generic cookie cutter housing instead of contextual localised design that reflects neighbourhood character. Whilst the aim of the reforms is to enable housing, we're losing the tools that make that housing livable, sustainable and respectful of neighbourhood character. This is not consistent with the objectives of planning for Victoria, having particular regard to public participation, environmental management, integrated planning and the fair and orderly development of land. So we want to suggest a better way forward. We're not here to oppose change, we're here to improve it. There should be strategy first, not statutory shortcuts. We need to look at actual strategy first. Local control should be retained. The schedules should be reinstated. Tree canopy should be aligned to the tree canopy target for Plan for Victoria. Open space standards should be increased so that canopy trees can thrive, and we need to preserve community voice. Third-party appeal rights should be reinstated, and there's a need to plan for infrastructure. We need to plan for that first, with clear responsibilities and funding before development occurs. So in conclusion, our challenge is not just about supply. We need homes people can afford, but also neighbourhoods people want to live in. Yes, we need growth, but we need open space and infrastructure to match that growth. And if we want to deliver faster housing, it should not be at the expense of design quality, neighbourhood character and community voice. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Councillor
Straight on to
Tawney?
me? Yes.
Please. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name's Sophie Tawney. I'm the Mayor of Boroondara, and I'm joined by Scott Walker, our Director of Urban Living. Thank you for the opportunity to present, and more importantly for your commitment in recognising the significance of planning reforms in addressing our housing crisis. At the start, I really would like to emphasise that Boroondara Council fully supports the need for increased housing density in our municipality. We know we need more houses and we want to play a role in that. And we've demonstrated this on multiple occasions with our own activity centre structure plans that plan for thousands of new homes, most recently for Camberwell Junction. We understand the Minister is supportive of this plan as it forms the core of their proposed activity centre for Camberwell. We're not opposed to the development of more housing, far from it. Our issue is with how this necessary growth is achieved. We think local expertise and local knowledge should drive this growth. That's why we would welcome the opportunity and actually indeed the obligation to demonstrate to the state government how we can deliver its housing expectations. This might require every council to complete the strategic work and genuine community consultation and engagement to plan for the future growth within, say, a 12-month period. By taking a holistic, integrated and importantly locally driven approach to planning, we'll create better communities for existing and for new residents. And on the new residents, we want to see more affordable and social housing built in Boroondara. We've got an excellent track record in advocating for this, and we're actually disappointed that the government's reforms don't include stronger measures to encourage the development of truly affordable housing and development of social housing stock. I know the housing crisis is affecting thousands of people, but blaming councils isn't right. As we've heard, there are thousands of planning approvals which are simply not being built. This means there is time to make the changes well and to deliver for our communities an approach which delivers more housing while adding value across every dimension of life in a growing city. Planning reform should give us a chance to show how we can do that. Let's not settle for second best. Now I'd like to hand over to Scott.
Thanks, Councillor. I will just elaborate a little bit more on perhaps our submission that was provided in writing, and it really pulls apart the concerns and the relationship with the objectives of the Planning Environment Act. Some of our key concerns with the planning reforms really relate to the lack of consultation and transparency in the process for devising and introducing the reforms, the failure to address the core issue of the affordable and public housing that's just been touched on, the concentration of decision making in the Minister for Planning rather than local communities, removal of contextual analysis and policy response to standardisation, and I will go to that in a bit more detail in a moment. Environmental impacts, including tree canopy loss, and failure really to provide an integrated planning approach. Many of these reforms have been developed independently without actually an understanding of how each of them impact on each other, and the res code relationship to the housing choices and transport zone is a great example of that. So I'm not going to go through all of those concerns one by one because they are included in our submission. We've also, I will touch on some of the process concerns that we've identified in our supplementary submission. But I just want to pick up on a couple of things that were raised, in fact, in earlier days of this committee hearing. We heard from the Department of Transport and Planning that Boroondara fully supports the housing target. So whilst Boroondara absolutely supports an increase in housing, and we're of the view that we can actually meet the housing target, we've got capacity for the housing target, we actually don't agree with how those housing targets were arrived at. The 65,500 new dwellings for Boroondara, which is an 88% increase on existing housing in the municipality, we have no clear understanding how that was arrived at. We have no clear understanding how that number relates to then the work that's being done for activity centre plans that in fact is having a housing number allocated to them after the event, after the plans are put in place. So we've in fact got this housing target being arrived at from a top-down allocation to the municipality, and then a bottom-up will allocate and decide how much is in each activity centre or location one by one. So there's a hope, perhaps, in the work that's being done that one day the two will meet. The bottom-up planning will eventually meet the bottom-down planning. It's like building a tunnel from two different points and hoping that it meets in the middle. The reform program for the 10 pilot activity centres, absolutely the way that the consultation was conducted, the way that the timing of the reforms and explanation to the community were conducted really were quite constrained. The timelines were quite constrained. The consultation explanations were quite constrained. Often the announcements were made on weekends. They were made during the council election period. There was a lack of information sharing. There's really been many refusals to provide relevant documentation. We actually have never had, before they were brought into place, a full draft of the Housing Choices and Transport Zone, or BFO, to comment on or refer to. And the BFO in particular is actually the delivery of the activity centre plans for each of the activity centres.
Graceful.
The Standing Advisory Committee process has been tightly controlled and not transparent, despite the terms of reference saying it's actually underpinned by transparency. Nothing could be further from the truth in actually how they rolled out those Standing Advisory Committees. Councils were not advised which matters were actually referred for consideration by the advisory committees, and the advisory committee reports were not made available until after the decisions had been made. And as we know, similar to the Whitehorse experience, the recommendations of the Standing Advisory Committee were ignored. In particular for Boroondara in relation to heritage overlays, where the Standing Advisory Committee clearly advised that the new Housing Choices and Transport Zone should not apply to the heritage areas. They also struggled to understand the logic of how those housing choice and transport zones were going to deliver on the objectives and outcomes that were sought. We've heard a lot about a focus on councils taking too long to make decisions and refusing too many developments. Boroondara refuses less than 3% of planning applications, and that's pretty common amongst other councils. More than 98% of residential applications are decided by officers under delegation, and 70% plus applications are determined in the 60 statutory day time frame. And most of those that aren't is because there are positive negotiations with applicants, with the developers, to achieve a better planning outcome. And it's involved input from the community to help influence a better outcome. And there are only a handful. In fact, I think we've only had one in the last 6 months where there's been an appeal due to council not making a decision within the 60 statutory timeframe. The removal of the contextual analysis for development and implementation of the deemed to comply approach under Res Code has resulted in our view, has resulted in a reduction of the neighbourhood character assessment to a series of numerical tick boxes. And this is a complete lack of understanding of what really makes up character. And critically, this removes any ability for council to negotiate design and development outcomes that respond to the site-specific features and the local context. The removal of environmental considerations is also highly concerning. So this deemed to comply nature of the code means that local planning policies designed to achieve better environmental outcomes, ESD, tree protection, are removed from the considerations. And where development is deemed to comply, only the minimal environmental considerations within the code can be considered. So I've prepared some examples of developments that were approved under Res Code and that were approved under Res Code and what the implications might be under the new code. Because it's important to understand that there is no fundamental, in our view, fundamental change in the yield of developments under Res Code. There are multiple pages there that take you through examples of where, in particular, trees and design of buildings to reflect the context of the area have been negotiated and agreed under the previous Res Code rules. The deemed to comply removes that capacity and ability, removes that assessment of local context. So, reiterating the earlier points raised by our Mayor, we believe that planning can be done to plan for future housing growth, that the way that we've arrived at these changes is lacks consultation and does not deliver any meaningful increase in dwelling yield, and it can be achieved in a much more positive way in terms of its relationship with local context of development.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Batista, yes.
Thank you. Annalise Batista, Director of Planning and Place at the City of Stonnington, and I'm joined by Hannah McBride-Burgess, who's our Manager of City Futures. A bit of local context. Of course, City of Stonnington is an inner urban council and comprises the suburbs of Armidale, Kooyong, Malvern East, Prahran, Toorak and parts of Glen Iris, South Yarra and Windsor. We're particularly affected by recent announcements in terms of planning reform, with 15 of 50 of the state government's proposed activity centres planned for Stonnington. And again, a bit of local context. Our population is growing and we do have stressed housing stock. So we're predicted to grow from 111,000 people in 2023 by 17%. And that, of course, places significant pressure on our planners to manage growth effectively. However, that's what councils do best. All councils, and Stonnington is no exception, have teams of expert planners, strategic land use planners and statutory planners whose business is managing and planning for growth. And they do it very effectively in close consultation with the community. An illustration of this is that Stonnington has capacity and has planned for capacity of 65,000 dwellings by 2051. Like my colleagues, that's well in excess of the state government's target of 50,000 by 2051. And we have a very strong track record in planning for growth. And the way we do that is a comprehensive and evidence-based approach to delivering our future housing needs, which is based on substantial community engagement and that best ensures the livability and amenity of local neighbourhoods. For example, we've recently released a draft housing strategy, this month in fact, and that draws on 5 years of community engagement and a comprehensive analysis of options to meet the local demand for housing and to direct growth in areas where it's appropriate with excellent transport infrastructure and amenity and open space. Importantly, we've got a social licence to do this as it's been developed in consultation with our community over years and is evidence-based. So we're very well placed and have been for some time to deliver on the government's population and housing growth targets. And it's fair to say that we were particularly disappointed that these amendments were largely announced through the media without consulting with local governments, by stealth, and that they represent major urban planning and public policy changes by stealth, not in consultation with the community or councils. And ultimately, they risk very poor long-term livability outcomes for our residents. Planning outcomes are best when they are arrived at in consultation with the community and done with the needs of future communities in mind. And importantly, when there's meaningful collaboration between all three levels of government. And that hasn't occurred in this case. That's me, I'm brief.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cripps.
Thank you for the opportunity to present to the committee. Bayside City Council has spent between 20 up to 20 years undertaking strategic planning throughout our municipality, has supported housing growth and has undertaken significant work around activity centres, identifying the preferred location for increased housing density around our main shopping precincts and transport hubs. This is established through community engagement with community knowledge, community understanding and community support. This work was also undertaken with the premise that by enabling growth to occur in one location, we have the ability to protect the cherished character and housing stock that people choose to live in across the remainder of our municipality. So whilst council supports growth and supports the increase in housing throughout our municipality, it needs to be balanced and it needs to be considered and it needs to be responsive to the location that it is to be delivered within. Councils play a very different role as the planning authority, but they also have a number of other responsibilities in delivering infrastructure and have clear knowledge of infrastructure, which has been absent within the current approach that the state government has undertaken in rolling out the amendments. There's been no consideration of the community infrastructure that needs to be delivered, the existing infrastructure in terms of stormwater networks, open space, and so on. And when councils undertake this work, they take into consideration all of these elements when developing their structure planning work and use that to justify the proposition when looking to rezone land. Another high point that I'll just start with is that Bayside City Council has continued to support growth and support development. Over 90% of our decisions and applications are to support proposals, and 85% of all of our decisions are made within the statutory timeframe. I will take you to a couple of key points that we've made through our submission, but won't go across the whole of our submission that we've put to the committee already. But the underlying principles of the planning system in Victoria have been under considerable scrutiny. These key underlying principles, we say, are sound strategic planning informed by proper technical assessment, proper public participation and a transparent process. And we say this has been notably absent in the reform process to date. Add this to the lack of any consideration of the findings and recommendations of the IBAC report, Operation Sandon, which came out in July 2023 and sought to reduce corruption in the planning system and make planning decisions more transparent And you can see that is why there is considerable angst at the changes that have taken place in a rapid-fire approach since October 2024. Notwithstanding this, the Victorian Government has recommended and endorsed 32 of the 34 recommendations in the Sandon report. And furthermore, the Minister for Planning, in adopting or announcing that position, made the following statement: Victorians deserve to have trust in the state planning system, and we're accepting these recommendations as part of our work to make sure good decisions are made faster and more transparently. We find ourselves in a planning system that is becoming more minister-centric, especially through the use of and potential overuse of the Development Facilitation Program, which operates largely behind closed doors, and then a reform process where the very advisory committees that had been established to review certain parts of the reform process itself has even expressed caution in their reports, outlining the limitations of their own in their own reports because of the very limited role they have been asked to play and the extremely short timeframes that they have been asked to work within, as well as their concerns at having been restricted from accessing information that may have otherwise been of assistance to them. On any review, the recent reports of the Standing Advisory Committee on the 10 activity centres are extraordinary and are clear and loud alarm bells. In context of what each 10 advisory committees have each stated, I asked this committee inquiry whether there can be any doubt that the VC amendments before them are a reflection of the Victorian Government simply wanting to get its reform agenda in place rather than being open and transparent about the planning reform. In our submission, the reform process has failed to meet the most basic requirements in relation to transparency. It is all the more disconcerting that the reform process has not been based on even mildly solid base of strategic planning, and that has been a traditional approach in the Victorian planning system, and which has been a hallmark of large-scale reforms in the past. What has and should always be part of what makes planning transparent and proper in Victoria is the fair engagement and inclusion of local government and communities. The key changes introduced by the VC amendments will culminate which have culminated in the recent VC252, were consulted for and mostly during the caretaker period of the recent local government elections in 2024. Were consulted without key background documents being available to either the public or local government, and were conducted, and the reviews were conducted behind closed doors with no public insight, input or ability to question. You do not need to take this Council's word for that. You can see that in the 10 reports the advisory committees have produced themselves. The introduction of new zones, overlays and housing codes was all done essentially behind closed doors with no proper consultation or ability for input into the process. Those zones were applied with no transparency in the process, all in the face of repeated concerns of the Standing Advisory Committee and Council and communities. Council also notes those reports were only released after the VC amendments were put in place and only after this inquiry was announced. Council was only provided during the actual process a copy of an example of the draft built form overlay controls in October last year in the middle of the consultation process. We were asked to review and respond within 3 business days during the caretaker period. We say this is not proper consultation. It is not that local government does not support housing or planning reforms, but it must be done in an informed and consultative manner and not in a heavy-handed way that is vindictive of certain communities. Council, like Bayside, have the strategic planning policies in place to ensure housing growth can be accommodated in the right locations. What is not supported and has never been properly or factually made correct by the Victorian Government is the justifiable and evidence-based reasons why these VC amendments are required. It has been based on on a narrative around the housing crisis. The explanation reports of the VC amendments state the amendments are required to increase the supply of social affordable housing. Council agrees that this is needed to provide social affordable housing in well-located areas and has its own, and in fact we have our own affordable housing strategy, and we have an amendment sitting with the Minister for Planning currently which would support affordable housing and has been waiting for authorisation for approximately 4 months.
Oh. Fancy that.
However, increasing the supply of housing does not necessarily result in increase in social and affordable housing, and particularly does not suggest that an increase of this housing would occur in well-located areas. We believe the approach that's been undertaken by the current reforms has been a generic approach which has placed significant controls and changes to planning controls across vast areas of our municipality. And based on the pilot program of the Moorabbin Activity Centre, we anticipate with the additional 4 activity areas identified in Bayside that 50% of our municipality will be covered by new planning controls which will support and encourage apartment living. Whilst people in Bayside wish to and choose to live in this location, they choose certain type of housing, and it hasn't always been apartment living. To conclude, we believe the reforms are not properly informed, the reforms have not been conducted in a transparent manner, and are opposite to what the Sandon report recommendations included. The reforms will wreak havoc on some of the beautiful parts of Melbourne and Bayside where rows of heritage properties are at risk under the weight of strong new zones and built form overlays. The government's own standing advisory committees spend more time setting out the limits of their reports than they do, confined to the ability of the inquiry. There has been no infrastructure planning, let alone proper infrastructure planning. And the other part, which hasn't been discussed from our submission but is included in our documentation, is the financial and tax implementation and implications that all of this is, I guess, being also affected by. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you very much. That was a really interesting set of submissions. We'll move into questions now, and I'll kick off. Let's start with a hypothetical. If there was a partial revocation to 267 to specifically address the exemptions, so I guess we're getting into Clause 65 of the Decision Guidelines and Section 60 of the Act. I guess I'd ask 2 questions. One, what is the likely impact on the throughput of applications? Is it likely to slow down the planning process? And the second one is, do you believe that it would have an adverse impact on investment in new built form in your municipalities? And perhaps we could start with Mr. Green and move our way up the table.
Thank you, Chair. So just to clarify, you're asking if there was a revocation, would that have that impact? Yeah. So I don't believe it would. I think as we've demonstrated already, we've got controls in place and policies in place that allow for significant capacity. And I think we've as the other councils here have stated, we are efficient at processing applications. The large majority of applications do get approved, and I think we've got the balance right at the moment. And I don't believe there'll be a negative impact in terms of growth and throughput.
And in terms of investment in built form, no adverse effect?
No, I think we've seen, especially Whitehorse, have seen significant investment across the municipality, especially around the activity centres. And I don't believe there'd be a negative impact on that.
Thank you. Boroondara?
Yeah, no, absolutely. We don't believe there would be any negative impact whatsoever in terms of permits and in terms of dwelling yield, and I talked about that earlier. We don't think there's any evidence that there's any likely increase in dwelling yield as a result of these changes, just a lowering standards. We might see some increased size of building footprint, unit sizes, dwelling sizes, but certainly not permits being issued or yield. There's been no uptick in applications as a result of these changes to date, and we certainly don't think there's any impact of a revocation.
Terrific, thank you.
Thank you. I would echo my colleagues' sentiments. We're well placed to both plan for growth but also process applications. City of Stonnington processes 98% of applications under delegation, with more than 70% delivered within the statutory timeframe of our 1,000 plus applications last financial year, only 34 were determined by the council. And to echo my colleague's sentiments, I don't think that there would be any impact on investment as a result of revoking the provisions, and what we haven't seen is any acceleration in investment or any rush to investment or any support from the development industry in response to the reform program.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the question. And within Bayside, given that approximately 90% of our municipality is residential, we have actually seen a significant decline in the number of built form applications and residential development occurring over the last few years. Since the introduction, and when I refer to that, in the order of about 30% reduction, which has been a reflection of other factors, not planning controls or reforms. With the implementation of these new controls, we have seen no deviation or change to the number of applications being received by council. Having said that, we don't believe that there would be any impact in terms of the removal of those controls on the processing of planning applications or the consideration and throughput of built form through the planning system. And we would be of the view that a better outcome could be achieved where you have community engagement and the ability to consider these applications in a site-specific location.
Terrific, thank you. This might be a slightly unfair question, but I guess the rubber hits the road in terms of the practical application of these in GC252. And I appreciate that's only been out for a very short period of time. That's half of the Moonee Valley one, so we're talking about a large amount of documentation. I guess I've got, again, two questions, and I'd like to go up and down the panel. One, were you consulted in the process of the development of 252, and if you could briefly explain whether you were or not? And two, have you had the opportunity to form a view as to the quality of the product that's been produced through GC252? So again, if I could start with Mr. Graham.
Thank you, Chair. We don't currently have any activity centres that have been implemented in Whitehorse. So we did temporarily have Pastor Mitcham in the Ringwood one, but that was actually removed through the process. So we haven't had a need at this stage to consider 252.
Swing and a miss on that one.
Yeah.
Over to Boroondara, sorry.
Yes. Okay, there's probably two parts to that. Mm-hmm. The first is the core of the activity centres, and in building up the original activity centre plans that are primarily based on the work that Boroondara did over 2.5 years, it's actually pretty close to what we were looking for. So we're pretty comfortable with the core of the activity centre and what that's been able to produce. I could critique the components, and we've got to work out how it actually applies on the ground, but generally pretty comfortable with the framework. The issue is the housing choice and transport zone, and we were not consulted in regard to that in any meaningful way whatsoever. Firstly, when it was first announced as a draft walkable catchment zone, and then when the final version of this was put together. Even in fact, the rules for the core, the final BFO, no consultation on that final component. So we've got some significant concerns with the housing choice and transport zone and the implications of that for development around the activity centre, and we do not fully understand why the Standing Advisory Committee advice hasn't been followed or adhered to either.
Terrific, thank you.
Thank you. In terms of consultation, we had a number of meetings with the department, most of which were in caretaker, and there was no, particularly around the catchment area, as Boroondara has said, there was no real engagement on the walkable catchment zone or the housing choice and transport zone as it is now, and would reiterate that Stonnington's position on that was that there's no strategic justification around Chadstone to have a catchment zone, and that's been borne out through our previous strategic work. It was reiterated by the Standing Advisory Committee that there was no strategic justification for it, and has now been implemented.
Thank you. And Mr. Cripps?
Through the pilot program, the question of whether we were consulted is one that I'd just like to refine, just possibly indicate we were informed and we had engagement with the department in an information-based scenario where we were asked questions and provided information from the department. Initially, we had a meeting with the Minister for Planning, who introduced the activity area and provided us an indication that this was going to be a partnership approach, and we were the client, but the rolling out of this project would be undertaken by the VPA and the Department of Transport and Planning. Subsequent to that, there were a number of meetings that were held primarily online, where we were informed of their work program and often told we weren't privy to certain information because it was not available to council. Ultimately, as per my submission earlier, we were not engaged until very late in the consultation process or the consideration process of the built form overlay, which we had 3 business days to respond to during caretaker, and the walkable catchments were never presented to council for feedback and engagement. We've subsequently raised issues with regards to those controls.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Mr. Davis.
Now, I'm going to try and go very quickly because I'm conscious of the time. First, I want to ask Scott and Mayor Tory the issue of dwelling targets in the City of Boroondara, and I think your point about coming from both ends is an interesting way to look at it. Essentially, there's about 70,000 dwellings in Boroondara now. The government wants to add 65,500 more dwellings in 25 or 30 years. That's the rough thing. Is there any infrastructure planned for that by the government?
There has not been any infrastructure plans that have been shown to us or demonstrated to us from the government, from the Department of Transport and Planning. And of course, given that we're
nearly twice the number of schools, or
absolutely schools, open space areas. And I know there's been some discussion about tree canopy, for example, being focused on council land or public land because it can't be accommodated with the 10% rule under ResCo, but you've got to have the capacity for all these things. You can't double dip on pieces of land. So yeah, open space, schools, transport, childcare, no infrastructure plans in place for those.
So let me come to a similar thing in Whitehorse. You don't have one of the large trial zones, but you do have suburban rail loop under the precinct VC274, 274. Is there any additional plan or money or requirement on infrastructure that is clear?
There isn't, and it's a major concern for council. With the suburban rail loop, for example, we've done some calculations at the moment in Box Hill. There's about 19 square metres of open space per person. With the growth that the SRL are forecasting for Box Hill, and with no further investment in open space, that would drop down to about 7 square metres per person.
Or, for example, at Deakin, in that around there, it seemed to me when I looked at the Sophie Aubrey article the other day, 2 days ago, it seemed to me there was not a jot of additional open space, but about 10 or 20,000 additional people.
Yeah, that's right, that's correct. And also what's of concern is that through the current SRLA process, through the amendment documentation, they've identified councils as lead agencies to deliver new community infrastructure that's needed to accommodate that growth. And yet we have no plan for that in our capital works program.
I'm just going to keep moving because I'm conscious of the time. And can I thank Boroondara for this document, very helpful document that visually lays out what will happen with the new Clause 55 provisions. Essentially, if you look at some of these plans, and it may be easier to go from the back, here there's a picture of what it would look like here. This would be cumulative impact on residential streetscapes. They look at a normal lot size and, yep, there's one version of it. These massive boxes of space where they could build to as of right. Am I understanding this correctly?
So this is actually conveying two things. This cumulative impact is in fact in the essentially the housing choice and transport zone. So this is the 6-storey and 4-storey outcomes on large blocks, 3 and stories on the smaller blocks. So that's what that's showing. In fact, this is modelled off a typical street. In fact, an example street in the Camberwell walkable catchment. The other diagrams are in fact trying to explain the res code changes and the turning off of broader considerations around other policy
Distance,
issues,
trees
character issues,
and
tree
so-
issues, and saying, actually, you no longer can get these quality, local context outcomes. So it's not going to change the dwelling yield in any significant way, but the quality of the outcome will change.
And huge loss of canopy.
Huge loss of canopy trees. Because the 10% canopy tree doesn't protect existing trees under that new rule.
So I'm going to keep moving. I'm sorry to be quick. Heritage and the impact of these amendments combined with the dwelling targets, with the GC 252.
Yep.
What are we going to see inside the walkable catchments or the whatever we call them now?
Yep.
The zones
Well-
in terms of heritage.
Well, that's where those that cumulative impact, whilst it's modelled on a street, a typical street in Boroondara at the back, that's potential outcomes in heritage areas. You can imagine that sort of built form in heritage areas. That's a potential impact as a result of the way the zones are constructed.
Does that apply in Bayside too?
That would be the similar scenario, yes.
Thank you, Mr.
Stonnington,
Davis.
yes.
Thank you. We'll come back if we've got some time. Mr. Batchelor.
Thanks so much, Chair, and thanks everyone for coming in. Lots to get through. Just a few things I want to clarify from some evidence that we've heard previously before the committee. Mr. Cripps, we heard from the Hyatt Progress Association today that they'd been told by the City of Bayside that they'd had no engagement with the Minister for Planning about these changes. My take from the evidence that you've just given is that that wasn't accurate.
That is correct. We had one meeting at the very commencement of the program with the Minister, where she met with myself and the Mayor.
And have you had any follow-up meetings since then?
Only when we were at the announcement of the next cohort of activity centres, but in between that time there was no further engagement with the Minister for Planning.
So you've had 2 meetings with the Minister in the course of this process?
One
Okay,
and-
but so not none, as was told to the residents
that would be
of
correct.
Hyatt. Just concerned that there might be some misinformation coming out
The
about.
community had no engagement.
Excuse me.
So we'll leave that. Just wanted to clarify that because I wouldn't want people to think that the council was potentially telling us residents one thing and the reality being another. The
That's cute.
other is I just want to go to this infrastructure question. We had some evidence from Infrastructure Victoria yesterday that their analysis suggests that looking at whether we are the housing, we've basically got a choice of trying to build more houses in the inner and middle suburbs versus on the urban growth, in urban growth areas. Infrastructure Victoria's view, based on their detailed analysis, which has obviously been an input into state government.
None of these amendments though.
Mr. Davis, thank you.
into policy development in this area shows that it's about up to $50,000 per dwelling cheaper to provide infrastructure provide housing in established suburbs. And they said that basically their analysis is that across the metropolitan area, there's capacity up to the late 2030s in terms of infrastructure capacity in the middle ring to accommodate more housing. Are they wrong or are you wrong in your analysis of the capacity of your communities to accommodate extra housing?
I think the starting point is that we haven't seen the evidence and the explanation.
You
of those-
haven't seen Infrastructure Victoria's reports?
we
that are publicly available.
We haven't seen the work that's been
You
done
haven't seen
by the state
infrastructure.
government to
just to
explain.
Is that the witness answer?
Just to clarify, we had evidence yesterday that reports have been made publicly available saying that there's capacity in existing infrastructure that applies in inner and Mr. Davis, if you would let other people talk, this committee process would go a lot smoother. We give you respect from time to time. We'd appreciate it in return. Have you seen that Infrastructure Victoria analysis?
I haven't seen that. We haven't pulled apart that analysis in light of
So you haven't
the plan,
seen- you haven't
plan
read
work that's
that analysis
that's
on
been put
infrastructure. Okay,
forward.
well-
It hasn't been put forward as part of this planning work That hasn't been put to the councils. That certainly hasn't.
But so you haven't
work that sits
okay,
behind it.
yeah, we'll take it that you haven't read that analysis. We had evidence from the Municipal Association of Victoria at a session immediately prior. The MAV is obviously the peak representative and advocacy body for local councils. They gave us evidence that the housing choice and transport zone meets the objectives of the Planning Act. Your evidence is that it doesn't. Again, why are you right? Why are they wrong? Why are they right? Why are you wrong?
If I may, it's my view is that, and I have seen the Infrastructure Victoria work at a high level. I haven't seen the workings. I haven't seen the data, the analysis or the modelling that sits underneath it. But certainly one thing it does do, and it plays a role, is attempt to look at the whole state and apply, if you like, a broad brush approach. And the unique role that councils play, and that councils are very effective in delivering, is considering local nuance and available infrastructure at a local level, both existing and what's possible through future planning and implementation. So I think that while it's useful to have a whole of state approach...
Sorry, just on the my question about the MAV, they've told us it complies with the objectives of the Planning Act. You've told us that it doesn't. You're both local councils.
If I may... I was getting to that, thank you. The MAV also has adopted a whole of state approach, as is their remit, to have a look at the proposed changes from a whole of state point of view. But where the rubber hits the road is at council level, and there are local nuances to take into consideration in terms of meeting housing targets.
Okay, thank you very much.
Chair.
Dr Mansfield.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for your submissions and for appearing today. And I just observed that nearly everyone here isn't actually an elected representative. You're staff of councils, and in my experience, it's unusual for staff of councils to be particularly critical, often a little bit more conservative and guarded in comments to government. It's even through the local government inquiry. So I guess I just make that observation. It's interesting to hear how refreshing strongly you're speaking about these changes. One thing that has been put to us through this committee, including by the government representatives of the department, is that we've got a crisis. We need to change things. The planning system's not delivering. We just need to try something. Let's just do it. Let's get it done. If there's problems, we'll fix it as we go. I guess I'd like to hear your thoughts about that, in particular with respect to, say, VC267. Which has statewide implications. We've heard a lot of concerns from MAV and yourselves about what could be some of the unintended consequences of this. Just like to get your thoughts on that sort of method of let's just give this a go.
I'm happy to answer that first. Thank you. So I think, as I submitted in my presentation, yes, there is a narrative that the planning system is broken from the state government. Whitehorse don't necessarily agree with that. I think we have approved a lot of dwellings across the whole municipality. I've yet to see any evidence from the state government about what issues the planning system is causing. I haven't seen any evidence that says this many dwellings could have been approved had the system been improved. And yet we see the consistent commentary around that the planning system is a bottleneck or an obstacle. So, as I said, we've created enormous capacity. We've shown that through the vast approvals we've given to a lot of very high density buildings in the right locations. And I don't believe that whilst there might be room for improvement, I don't believe the approach taken by the state government here is necessary. And I'm of the firm view that we will continue, as we have in the past, to deliver approvals for housing supply.
It's interesting. It's back to the future. We're going from a prescriptive planning system, or we're going to a prescriptive planning system that we had in the early 90s, and we moved away from that as a planning industry because the quality of outcomes delivered on the ground was not acceptable, and was not acceptable to the community, not acceptable in terms of the future of those locations. The six-pack walk-up flats. People love them now, some of them, but that's an example of a prescriptive planning system. We have not had that for 20 or 30 years. To simply go back to a prescriptive planning system and compromise the quality of outcomes is an experiment that's going to have consequences for years and years to come.
I would suggest there's an opportunity for government to work more closely with councils rather than just try it and see. I think that we have a lot of data and evidence that, and also have developed plans in close consultation with the community. As I mentioned earlier, we have a social licence, but there are improvements to be made at a state level and local level, and we will only realise them if we work more collaboratively and transparently.
And from Bayside City Council's perspective, the Planning Environment Act is actually, and has been, a leading piece of legislation which a lot of other states have looked to develop their own. Is it broken? We would say no. Is the system broken? No. Are there opportunities for improvement? Absolutely. And some of those sit within local government and some of those sit within the state government authorities. So referral agencies are under-resourced. VCAT has had massive lead times to have matters heard. Again, it's a resourcing issue which sits outside the local government context. You've heard from my colleagues here today about the efficiencies that they've implemented within the consideration of planning applications and are able to deliver outcomes. And so the suggestion that the system is broken, we would say, is an incorrect narrative. In terms of trial, as suggested from Mr. Walker regarding the implications on built form, it will be lasting. It's not just a let's trial and we can erase that in a couple of in a year or so if it fails. This is built forms that will sit there for 100 years, if not more.
Ms. Cruz.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you all for appearing before the committee and your evidence and your submissions. Mr Cripps, can I go back and just clarify something? In questioning from Mr Batchelor, you mentioned that you were at an announcement with the Minister. So was that an announcement or was that a meeting?
So just to clarify, we had a meeting with the Minister. The Mayor and myself met with the Minister to be introduced to the pilot program. So this was before the department had even commenced any work. It was the initial announcement when the government released its program. And that was about a 30-minute online discussion.
Online? Oh, it wasn't even in person. Okay.
And then we had a second meeting just recently with the announcement of the remaining 50 activity centres where we met with the Minister at Parliament to hear about the proposed program that the government was intending to roll out.
And that was with all of you, was it? Did you all meet with the Minister as well? Have you all met with the Minister?
City of Stonnington had one meeting with the Minister after the second round of announcements about secondary activity centres.
And Boroondara had one in January with the Minister. We've had a number of meetings with the Minister's advisors.
Yes. So, but that, in terms of that consultation that you've all expressed the frustration around, the process. You've met with the Minister, you would have expressed your concerns around that clearly. What was the feedback from the Minister around those concerns?
I'll have first attempt at that. So we've had one meeting with the Minister, and that was just before they released the final versions of the pilot activity centres. And I guess one thing we did hear from the Minister was that they had taken some learnings from the pilot process that they would then use to improve the process for the rollout of the next 50 centres. So there was that concession, I guess, and yes, we did make our concerns clear in terms of what's happened in the past and what might happen in the future.
So they did take on those concerns. I think we've heard that previously, but that's around the edges. That's not actually the big issues that you are referring to and the concerns around the process. You've talked about when you were in caretaker and the lack of timing. Can I go to Mr Green? And you said that 1,000 submissions were written, but only 5 were referred to the Standing Advisory Committee. Why only 5?
I don't know. So this is for the Ringwood Activity Centre. I read the report recently, and there was, I think, 1,001
Who made that
submissions.
decision of who
And
goes?
I believe that the Department of Transport Planning, on
Yep.
behalf of the Minister,
Thank you.
decided what got referred.
Okay,
Yep.
can I also go to your evidence that you provided in relation to, and it goes to Mr Walker's document, I think. You mentioned this approach by government is going to have an impact, and correct me if I'm wrong, quality of livability.
Yep.
What did you mean by that?
I think a big factor in that is tree canopy. So as I stated in my submission, we've got at the moment municipal-wide tree controls, and we've got a target under our urban forest strategy of 30% tree canopy. We've got a major concern that livability will be significantly impacted by loss of tree canopy in terms of the urban heat island effect, general amenity, shade, etc. So I think that there will be a big loss of tree canopy through this amendment.
And you also, in your evidence, talked about the tax system. You said that market dynamics, and you said resources, construction costs, the permits that have been issued, the hold-ups. So that tax implications, are you worried that some of that may be passed on to local government and therefore ratepayers that'll have to foot the bills for the government's approach?
In a general sense, there is a chance that that could happen, and I'm thinking in particular with the suburban road loop, where my understanding is a third of the funding of that is going to come through what they call a value capture. So we don't have any details on that, but I think there is a chance that it could be passed on to
So that,
residents.
does anyone else want to comment on that in relation to some of that, the tax implications? Bayside?
So from Bayside City Council's perspective, we don't believe, first of all, that there is a shortage of housing supply. We know that there are a large number of apartments that are available, which are still sitting there waiting for sale and occupation. I don't think it's necessarily going to be a direct cost burden directly on council, but it will make the dwellings that are delivered unaffordable or increase the cost on those. Whatever the developer has to pay through tax, through other charges, will be passed on ultimately to the person who purchased the property.
Thank you.
Okay. Ms Watts, over to you.
I think I'm ready to go. Hello. Thank you very much for your submissions and for being here today. I'm actually going to repeat a question that I asked earlier today, but also yesterday, and that's about the equity in the delivery of supply of new homes across Middle Melbourne. What we are seeing is the statistics over the last 30 years. Looking at your council areas versus some in the north and the west, there is quite a marked difference in the supply, particularly within the same distance to the city and other parameters. The ones that come to mind are Maribyrnong and Yarra are delivering about twice as much as Bayside and perhaps Stonnington or Boroondara. I'm interested in your reflections on why it is that comparative to other councils, your numbers are so markedly different. Is there any reflections? And perhaps I'll start with Bayside, given you.
From Bayside City Council's perspective, I think we provide and have a different expectation in the delivery of housing compared to other locations like you've referred to as in more of an inner city location. People who tend to be living within Yarra and the Footscray locations, close to the city.
Moonee Valley.
But they're close to, significant and high levels of infrastructure, high levels of amenity, and they choose to live in a particular housing type. From Bayside City Council's perspective, year after year, our community engagement highlights that planning and good planning quality outcomes is one of the priorities for our community, and they've been very, very clear from a community perspective that they're happy to support development in the right location but protect the amenity and the quality of housing elsewhere. So there's that component. The second part is most likely around the cost of construction, cost of land, and I guess the product that people and developers tend to deliver. We recently had an application called in by the Minister at the former Xavier school site in Brighton. The developer on that site has looked to deliver 2- and 3-storey buildings and apartment and townhouse development across that site. it has the capacity, or could have had capacity, for greater uplift than that. They chose not to because it wasn't the market they were looking to sell to. They saw that it was a high-end market opposed to building something in the growth areas where they would have put a different housing product in and a different quality of product in that location. So from a Bayside perspective, we're not necessarily opposed to construction or development, but developers
wealthy
choose.
homes.
But-
Yeah, sorry, you go to it.
The council rejected that application.
I cede my time to Ryan Batchelor.
But the council rejected that
So
application.
council was working with the applicant. They were not opposed to the proposal
Did
overall.
the council
but
reject the application?
The council refused the outcome on the basis of primarily parking and traffic-related issues. I'm using that as an example of a developer who chose to construct 2- and 3-storey development versus and looking at a different product and a different housing. And I can refer to a number of other areas across the municipality where apartments, for instance, there's products of $10 million apartments being proposed within our activity areas, which is a
So you don't
different
think
product.
there's demand for more affordable accommodation in Bayside?
I have not said that. There is definitely demand for a more affordable product. Council does not provide the product per se. We work within the planning controls, and the development industry will look at how they can deliver housing, and they will look at what delivery of the type of housing they can maximise, obviously, their business case and yield from. And what we've been finding within Bayside is that we tend to get higher quality development, which is seeking a higher return on housing types. We have a 1,000 apartment development being delivered at the former CSIRO site in Hyatt. Again, we have that located close to public transport, 7 storeys in height. Council fully supported it above the actual height restrictions that were set as preferred. They increased the height in order to get additional housing, and council implemented its own affordable housing approach of Homes for Homes, where the developer was not prepared to deliver affordable housing on site, but was prepared to make a contribution so that through Homes for Homes for affordable housing to be delivered elsewhere. So there are a number of different levers that can be considered, but for Bayside, we would say that the market dictates the type of housing, and it tends to be a different type of housing to what you'd find within Yarra, not necessarily by councils doing, but by the developers and development industry.
Okay.
There's a significant difference in cost of development on the fringe versus established areas, and complexity of development.
Yeah, I'm not going fringe versus...
Fringe versus established areas. You can't look at a percentage comparison either in terms of percentage growth from fringe to established areas, which has been done in the past. We've had significant growth
I wouldn't
in
argue
established
that
areas.
Marybeck and Darebin are fringe suburbs.
No, but
Moonee
Boroondara has
Valley
actually
and-
had substantial growth along the corridor between Camberwell and Hawthorn, for example. So if you actually have a look at Burwood Road to the railway line,
There's less people
There's
moving in
eight
there.
to 10-storey developments, one after the other in that sort of location. Is there planning that can be done for other activity centres like Camberwell, like we have just done, to support that type of growth in those great locations? Absolutely. We'd love to see more of the developments happen that we've approved over the last 3 or 4 years.
But proportionally.
All right, we're
there's
going
more
to leave it there, I think, if it's all right.
Yeah.
Mrs MacArthur.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, everyone, for appearing. I just want to refute this lie that local government are responsible for the fact we don't have enough housing. You have all indicated, and perhaps you can take on notice, the numbers of approvals that you've given in the timeframe allocated, but also the number of projects that have not gone to market because of the increasing cost permits granted but not gone to market because of the extraordinary cost in taxes, charges, all the various tapes, cultural heritage assessments, the cost of doing construction, and the lack of supplies. So that's the reason why your developments have been approved but they're not going to market. So there is plenty of capacity for houses to be built, but government have been the problem. Would you like to comment?
Thank you. I think there are some valid points in there, and I think I look at Box Hill, for example, where we have issued permits for substantial developments, and I'm thinking, for example, of the Box Hill Central redevelopment, which is for like seven towers. That was approved about a year ago, and part of that was actually approved 3 years ago, and that's about 1,700 dwellings alone. and nothing's happened. So, my understanding is that's because of market conditions for the residential market, and there are lots of other examples across Whitehorse like that.
And so Boroondara, same story?
Camberwell Activity Centre, we've approved a number of multi-level 10, 12-storey apartment developments or mixed-use and apartment developments over the last couple of years. They're not starting.
Yeah.
They're not starting construction. So it's not the approvals that's causing the
Yeah,
problem.
exactly.
In fact, the gap between approvals and commencements is widening because we keep approving, but they're not starting.
Councils don't deliver housing. We are facilitators of housing and we do a very good job. Council, in Stonnington's case, also has permits that are not acted on. And what we are seeing is a trend by the market, by the development industry, to de-scope what's been approved through amendments because the cost of construction is too high at the moment.
And similarly, from Bayside City Council's perspective, it's not necessarily planning that's holding up developments. We're seeing a large number of developers seeking extension of times to extend their permits or amendments to change the mix of dwellings that are being provided. My understanding, MAV produced a document that suggests there's 450 dwellings live through live permits which have been approved by local government, which have not been acted upon. And so there is ample approvals sitting within the market.
Yeah, and you might also want to take on notice, if you like, how many amendments you're still waiting for the Minister to approve and the delay that's causing in delivering an outcome. So I don't expect you to tell us now, but if you can produce it pretty quickly, that would be incredibly helpful. I also want to go to the lack of consultation that's occurred, not only with councils, with the MAV, your peak body, but with your communities. And is this dictatorial approach to planning a way of the future? Are you going to be just shut out of the whole process and irrelevant to the way we do business in this state, do you believe?
That's a very tough question to pose. I think the examples that we've been experiencing has suggested that the way that the department, on behalf of the Minister, has engaged has been one which hasn't been completely transparent, hasn't been holistic in what they have produced. It has been generally approved through what we know as 20 Part 4 planning scheme amendments, where even where there are submissions, they may not be given the opportunity to be considered, or they've issued little weight.
Consultations turned off.
And with all of the planning reforms that are being proposed, it is to remove third-party rights in a number of instances, or council are going to find themselves in an unusual position where we have to advertise applications, we can receive objections, but we can't consider those objections where things are deemed to comply. In Bayside's scenario, where we have 3 objections, that is reported to our planning committee, and councillors will be placed in a similar scenario of dealing with community members who may be at unease with the proposal and will need to approve those things, putting them in a difficult position.
Can I just go to the cost to ratepayers that's going to occur if these new proposals go ahead? What infrastructure costs are the ratepayers going to bear to deliver these tall towers?
So in relation to Box Hill, for example,
yes,
so I mean,
council.
in terms of the growth that's being forecast by, say, the Suburban Rail Loop Authority or the state government, as we've said previously, the infrastructure funding is not there for a lot of it, and
So you're going to have to meet the shortfall?
we hope not, but I know there is a review of the infrastructure contribution system underway. However, what is of a major concern is that hasn't been finalised, and yet they're making all these changes to the statutory planning system ahead of a review of the Planning and Environment Act and ahead of a review of the infrastructure contributions. It's all back to front.
The development contribution system, new system, we don't know what it is or what the detail is or how much money or whether that comes to council or the state government, does not commence until 2027. So all of the developments that are approved under these new changes now will avoid the development contribution system. So the councils will need to pick up the tab until there's future. It has only been rolled out in 2027 for the 10 pilot activity centres. not for the other 60 or other 50 centres to make up the 60, and then any other centre that's planned for over the next couple of years. So those centres, in fact, won't even get the benefit of the 2027 changes. It'll be some time beyond that. So it's extraordinary that there's a fundamental change of the planning system that creates opportunity for permits that avoids that infrastructure contribution.
Thank you. I would also talk to the local nuance again, because the cost of delivering infrastructure in grey fields and brownfields and old areas, established areas, if you like, such as Stonnington, is significantly more than on the fringes.
Similarly for Bayside, we understand that delivering infrastructure within the established location is significantly expensive, given the constraints that you're working within. But based on the plans that we've seen, whether it be from the SRLA or whether it be through the Activity Centre program, there is this big question of where the funding will come from and how much is council now going to be liable for. We're already in a rate-capped environment, and the ability to deliver infrastructure for a community is difficult already. I think we've estimated $80 million of kindergartens to deliver the current infrastructure needs to be delivered within Bayside to deliver on the current government's 3-year-old kindergarten program. So in order to deliver infrastructure, there is an important piece that we need to be able to unpack, and we are concerned that lack of that infrastructure planning places council in a potential financial disadvantage and potential hole.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. McIntosh, take us out.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. With Plan Melbourne and Plan Victoria, we've got the 70% in established suburbs and 30% in new suburbs, greenfield areas. Just wanted to understand your thoughts on that approach to planning with that ratio.
So from Bayside's perspective, we believe that it's going to be difficult to deliver on that ratio. Now, the reason we say that, and regardless of whether you have a community or an area that is supportive of the development, established areas are already made up of small lots owned by different people, and in order to actually get the yield of land, you need to acquire a whole lot of different properties. You need to work through a whole lot of different titled pieces of land to garner enough property to start building some of the housing that's been identified through the planning reform changes. So can you deliver additional housing? Absolutely. The difficulties are the constraints that the established areas provide, which will make it extremely difficult from our perspective, we believe, to deliver the 70% within the established areas versus 30% on the fringe.
There's a lot of logic in focusing infill development on established areas. There's a lot of logic to that. And, as a planner, that makes sense to do that. Is it 70%, 30%? Don't know, but where's the work that actually explains that makes sense and that works? And that's the difficulty that we have. But absolutely, there needs to be a shift to greater focus on established areas, and places like Camberwell are great locations to have additional housing. So there's no question around that. The issue is actually, is that the right number? Does that work? And have we got the infrastructure? Have we got the plans in place? And have we got the guidance in place to get the really good outcomes and quality outcomes that we need for our community to live in and be part of into the future? That's the issue here.
Absolutely achievable, as we've discussed during, with talking about our own plans to deliver housing and free up capacity versus the targets that we've been provided. Yes, we can deliver it. To Scott's point, it's about delivering it in the right locations with the right level of local input and nuance, so that we don't stress existing infrastructure and create really poor amenity outcomes for future residents.
So I think in the right locations it can be achieved. I'm conscious that for a council like Whitehorse, not every part of the municipality is well serviced by, say, fixed rail transport. But I think in locations that are, and I think we've demonstrated already that we can definitely achieve that type of growth, provided the infrastructure is also there to match that growth.
I'll jump in here, the non-technical person in the room. But really, I think what you're hearing, it's definitely our view here, and I think I'm hearing it across the room. One of the biggest concerns is trust the councils to deliver. They're already doing the work. We've all done so much work for many years on this. We are delivering, and work with us Let us do the plans. We know the communities. We know where the growth can happen, and we know we can do it in the right way. So don't let councils be part of it. You know, give us 12 months. Give us the time to develop the plans to deliver the targets.
Mr. Cripps, I was going to just ask some of your opening remarks just around some of the statistics of, I think it was permit approvals and whatnot. Just was wondering if you could unpack that a little bit more as far as what was a renovation. I think
My understanding is the MAV has undertaken a piece of work with all of councils across Melbourne to understand how many planning permits have been issued and are still live but not acted upon. And based on all those planning permits, there is 450 dwellings that have been approved across Melbourne, which are currently live but not acted
Sorry,
upon.
I think your opening statements were around what, as within your council, you've been able to approve over time. So I suppose it's just that I just twigged my attention. You said a few numbers, but I don't know if you exactly went to the number of new homes, for example, as opposed to...
So Bayside City Council have been having delivered new housing within the municipality of around 500 new dwellings annually. And that has been pretty much the trend for a number of years, which has been in line with previous views around the growth that was expected and having a 15-year supply within the municipality. I think I referred to in my opening remarks our approval process, which has been around the 90% being approved, developments being approved, and that's primarily residential. And 85% of those within the statutory timeframe. So
that's jogged my memory. So of that, and sorry, you might not know this off the top of your head, but what percentage of that would be, say, renovations or other sorts of applications versus new, full new homes and dwellings?
Within Bayside, I would be saying that you're probably considering around 90% of those being either medium density or apartment developments where we're dealing with residential. We have limited number of renovations, primarily with the previous government announcements around lot sizes and dwellings where they trigger planning permits. That's removed, I think, about 50 to 60 applications we receive annually as a result of that amendment. So in the last 12 months, the vast majority would be medium density or apartment development.
Thanks. Thank you all.
All right.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McIntosh. That's a wrap for this session. Could I, on behalf of the Select Committee, could I thank you very much for your attendance, for your really thoughtful and productive contributions. It's much appreciated. You will receive a copy of transcript for review before it's published, so we'll ask you to turn that around quickly. And at this point in time, we will take the broadcast offline for